Welcome to Drinks and Diplomacy, where we are cheersing to key concepts in national security. My name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, as well as one of your co-hosts for this fun look at what you need to know about foreign policy. I'm here with my co-host,
Andrea Castillo. I am a program officer with World Oregon.
We're both so excited for this conversation and want to thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you guys all taking an interest in learning a little bit more about what's going on around the world, what you are needing to know in order to be a true global citizen. So today we are diving into national security. What is it? Who drives it? Why do we need it? All those big, good questions that will have our wonderful go-to person, at least for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, Dr. Melinda Negron-Gonzales. We'll get to her introduction in a second, but of course, the most important part of the drinks and diplomacy drinks coming first in the name. We've got our drinks for the day. So for me, when thinking of national security, at least from the Western perspective, who is the fictional character who provides the most national security for any single country? Of course, it's got to be James Bond, right? I went a little bit with a variation on his famous drink, the martini, and made mine dirty because, let's be honest, national security is not a clean business here. So we can't have a nice, clean, straight vodka martini. Add a little olive juice, make it nice and tasty. And I'll be honest here, it's really just because I love garlic stuffed olives, and it's an excuse to have some garlic stuffed olives. They are delicious and wonderful, and it's a great way to finish off your week or, midweek, whenever we may be recording this that you don't know about. So anyway, that's my drink. Andrea, how about you? What are you bringing to the table today?
Tim, I will tell you, I have not hopped on the olives in my drink train yet. It's not my most favorite piece, but
once you grow up, you'll get on the train.
Once I grow up, yeah, we'll see what happens there. I'm more of a fruity drink type of person, but okay, y'all are gonna laugh because my drink today is very simple, but there's an absolute reason for it. Okay, so stay with me. My drink today is actually just water in my hydro flask, and specifically in a hydro flask because, okay, this is important for the context, right? So when I think of national security, the first thing that popped into my mind was airports and TSA, right? And how every time I go to the airport, the one thing that is a sure constant is that I always forget to empty out my water bottle before getting into the line for TSA. And I actually just realized that the 3-ounce liquid rule has actually just been a thing since 2006. And that's new to me. And so just being able to understand that context that, there's actually a reason why I have to empty out my water bottle and why TSA has taken some of my shampoo bottles when I'm going through checking. So I was thinking about it and I was like, you know what? Water makes the most sense for me today. I'll have more fun drinks the other episodes, but yeah, that was kind of just what my thinking went for today.
I like it. I think it fits well, and kind of a screw you to all of the people who have done stupid things on airplanes that have made us have to take off our shoes, our jackets, our belts, our water bottles being emptied, and all of the fun stuff that we get to do in the name of national security. And I think that is going to be a key factor. And part of our conversation is what civil liberties do people give up for national security? So turning to our speaker and know-it-all of the day, we have Dr. Melinda Negron-Gonzales of UNH Manchester, Department Chair of Security Studies, and all-around awesome person. If you've listened to any of my other podcasts, we have a lot of fun with Melinda, and I expect nothing less from you today, Melinda. So what are you bringing to the table for your drink today?
Well, before I get to that, can I just say that I have given up bottles, plural, of cava from Spain at London Heathrow Airport for the sake of national security, apparently, and I was not very happy about it.
Well, again, we need to find the people who made this all a problem for us, and
exactly,
take them out on a pole or something.
Yeah. So Tim, you decided to have a dirty martini because politics is dirty and national security is, a dirty game. I went the opposite direction and decided to have something fruity and fun because you got to get that balance, right? So I'm having a pina colada, but I have to change it up because I'm not a rum drinker. And so vodka can be added to a pina colada in place of rum, just as delicious.
I do have to ask.
Yeah.
Puerto Rican heritage, swapping out rum or vodka for rum. Is that really allowed?
You know that I wouldn't do it if I didn't have to. This is bizarre. I have a fructose intolerance and I can't drink things that are high in fructose, which rum is very high in fructose. All right. So, but I did choose a Puerto Rican drink specifically because that also comes to mind when I think about power and national security and colonialism. And so the fruitiness of the pina colada is there to counter the bitterness of the colonialism that Puerto Rican islanders must grapple with every day.
Wow. Deep stuff here.
Thank you.
All about it.
This is the drinks and diplomacy part. I know that the diplomacy part might be a little confusing, but we're not here to go that deep, Melinda. Just the right amount.
We're getting started with a little controversy.
All right, fair enough. You bring us to an interesting point to kick off, but I think the most important thing for people to understand when they are getting involved with programs that are focusing on international relations and want to know what national security means for them is to define what in the world national security is. It seems like everything that we hear is national security, whether it's climate change or economic or water bottles on airplanes. It is all national security, but can it all really be national security, or are we all just playing fun games here to make things more confusing than they need to be? So can you give us a little bit of insight into what exactly national security means to you?
National security is indeed incredibly broad and can be just about anything under the sun. We have this thing in international relations scholarship called securitization or securitization theory, and it's basically the act of making something a concern of national security. So, national security entails all of the activities that are carried out by a country's government to protect its citizens, to protect its economy, to protect other critical institutions and critical infrastructure from military and non-military threats. And the list is quite long for what counts as a national security threat. So COVID, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and yes, COVID has been deemed a national security threat.
Well, don't tell me it's just the middle. We've got to be like tail end at this point, please.
I know.
Wishful thinking.
Trying to dive a little deeper, can you give us some of the maybe top areas of national security when we're talking about the National Security Council or the National Security Advisor? What are their main roles? What are their main focuses? What issues are they really looking at as the top priorities for national security in 2022?
Yeah, so I think when most people think of national security, they think about issues of war and peace. And that is certainly on the minds of the foreign policy makers in DC and other capitals around the world. War is incredibly costly, and we are always on the lookout for aggressive behavior by friends and foes alike, but especially by countries that the U.S. considers to be its adversaries. And so, some of the top issues that take up the time of policymakers in Washington are issues concerning Russia's behavior, not just directly toward the United States, but Russia's behavior towards its friends and foes. So, the war in Ukraine, for example, is of such interest in the United States because it's Russia that invaded Ukraine, and Russia is one of our top competitors in the world. Of course, China is at the very top of the list when we're talking about U.S. national security. And there we have to think about the threat posed by China's economic prowess, if you will. And so it's not just issues of war and peace. In order to fight a good war, you better have some money. And in order to have a lot of money, you have to have a thriving economy. And so economic competitors like China are of great interest to U.S. policymakers. So Russia, China, the big hegemons of the world, superpowers, and issues of war and peace. So you can also think about Iran, the potential threat posed by Iranian nuclear weapons if they get them.
I'm really curious too, like, as you know, and as our listeners know, coming into Drinks and Diplomacy, a big piece of this is just understanding what are some things that we need to know coming into understanding national security, right? And so we talked a little bit about national security advisors, folks who are working on foreign policy. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about like key players and the decision makers in national security. Who are those that are making the key national security decisions and understanding and communicating that information out to folks?
Sure. So the president and the executive branch is at the center of it all when it comes to foreign policy, which is distinct from public policy with regard to more domestic matters where Congress plays a significant role. The president has a lot of leeway, and the executive branch has a lot of wiggle room and a lot of influence when it comes to foreign policy. And so the president has to provide Congress with a national security strategy every year where the president's vision for the U.S. globally is really mapped out. And so it's a discussion about the U.S.'s national security interests and U.S. commitments to our friends and allies and partners around the world and why we have those commitments and what are our objectives and what are our tools that are available to help the U.S. meet those objectives. And so that concerns things like U.S. defense capabilities, right? I mean, if we say that, we are very concerned about Russian aggression towards its neighbors, we're thinking about how the U.S. needs to prepare for a potential war with a competitor like Russia. And so all of that kind of stuff makes it into the national security strategy. And I forgot terrorism. How can I forget terrorism? Back in the day, especially in the immediate period after post 9/11, terrorism, countering terrorism was a focal point of the national security strategy of the Bush administration, of the Obama administration, and then the Trump administration. And here we are in 2022, and there's been this trend that really started a few administrations back to move away from counterterrorism and the threats posed by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other related groups toward the threats posed by some of our quote unquote great power competitors like Russia and China. And so, the president and his national security team play a major role in setting out the objectives and setting out the contours of that particular administration's foreign policy objectives. And then, of course, you have the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which also plays a role in mapping out U.S. national security policy. You've got other key players in the foreign policy establishment in D.C. in particular, people at the State Department, of course, and the intelligence agencies, of which there are over 15, all the way down to, everyday citizens like you and me, although the degree to which everyday citizens play a direct role in foreign policy making is up for debate.
Well, I'd say the goal of organizations like World Oregon and World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is to ensure that
right.
citizens have a voice and that they know what's going on.
That's
so
right.
that they can make their informed decisions, and even a small act such as clicking on an article gets those algorithms working and thinking, oh, more and more people are interested in what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in China. And so there are little things that people can do to create that butterfly effect that ripples across the world.
Absolutely.
You briefly mentioned, or I briefly mentioned as well, the National Security Advisor, who currently is Jake Sullivan, or the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Non-cabinet position, but highly important when it comes to national security. We didn't have that position until 1953, which is actually something I didn't find out until I started doing some research about this. Post-World War, which is kind of interesting. We apparently did not have any national security prior to World War II. So can you talk a little bit about what that role is? What do they actually do? I mean, we all have heard about the National Security Advisor, but I don't think many people know what their role actually is.
So, I mean, think about what any advisor in any industry does. I mean, they advise. And so the National Security Advisor really is the president's go-to person for advice on any number of foreign policy interests. And so, the National Security Advisor is someone who is an expert on foreign affairs. And if you've heard Jake Sullivan speak, and I have in person, and his knowledge is profound, you want a national security advisor who has depth and breadth of knowledge on a wide range of things. There are a lot of experts out there who have expertise in, let's say, nuclear deterrence or in, economic statecraft and sanctions and whether they work or not. But the National Security Advisor is expected to have this breadth of knowledge so that if something flares up suddenly in the world, I don't know, a great power attacks a neighbor of interest, that National Security Advisor already has ideas for how the U.S. should be responding. And so, the National Security Council that is led by the president includes key players such as the vice president and the head of the Department of State and the head of the Department of Defense and so on. But, the National Security Advisor is sort of this focal point actor who's taking into account all of the different players domestically, internationally, and helping the president and his team really craft a strategy, especially in times of crisis. The National Security Advisor is someone who is able to think quickly on their feet and knows enough to have a plan already for all of these possibilities.
So would you say it's someone who thrives on a lot of sleep or a lot of coffee?
No, I don't know how these people sleep at all.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like quite the portfolio of things to be keeping an eye on, because it can range from Russia invading Ukraine, China blockading the entirety of Taiwan, or a tsunami hitting the western coast of South America. These are all things that they need to be ready to plan for and be ready to have policy options and responses available to the president. You slightly mentioned, or you mentioned a couple people who comprise the National Security Council. Who is all on there, and why are they important to be in that role?
The National Security Council is typically made up of, the VP and the heads of Treasury and State and Defense and so on. And those players are important because the U.S. has a wide range of tools at its disposal for pursuing its interests globally. And you want the head of the Treasury Department there, for example, because sanctions play a major role in American foreign policy making and are a significant tool in the toolkit. And so you have all of those players typically on the National Security Council at every meeting, but then the president is free to invite others in an ad hoc manner. And so if there are other people of interest who should join because of the topic of the day, then the president may invite someone else from one of the other executive branches. And it can vary. And so when you look at different administrations, the president is free to build his National Security Council as he or she, it's always a he, sorry, sees fit.
So far, Melinda, so far.
so
All
far.
right.
Yeah, so you want people who are representing the different agencies that are really key to foreign policy.
And in the world of DC acronym soup, you have the NSC. You also have the NSA, the National Security Agency. And I think a lot of people might be a little bit more familiar, or at least have heard that acronym a little bit more, particularly post 9/11. How do they fit into all of this craziness that we call national security?
I wasn't expecting to answer that question. Okay.
That's what we do here. We make sure that we find the tough questions and we ask them.
And it's not a tough question at all. I simply haven't taught my American Foreign Policy class in the last 2.5 years.
What have you been doing? COVID? I mean, come on.
I've been doing only Global South stuff. What did you ask me? National security.
What's the National Security Agency, and why are they not listening in on our podcast right now? Or are they?
Well, so, I would like to think that we are very important and they are listening in. But the chances are slim that the NSA is listening in. However, they are involved in listening in on other discussions that are taking place around the world, and so they do play a role in gathering intelligence, which is absolutely crucial for the US being able to know how to respond to national security threats.
And on that line, I guess one of the things I'm more curious about is if you could touch on this aspect of internal and external threats to national security, right? A lot of the time when I'm hearing about national security threats, they seem very external, and the focus doesn't really touch on or is not emphasized on internal national security threats. So wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, that's a great point. And it is definitely the case that when we think about national security, we often think of threats that emerge from outside of the country. But it is, of course, also true that national security threats emerge domestically. And so, I brought up the pandemic earlier, and there's an example of something that is truly global in scope, and that, is certainly a domestic priority issue and an issue of national security that has domestic implications. And terrorism is another area that you can think about as a national security threat that emerges domestically as well as internationally. And so it's not always easy to draw this line between domestic and international threats.
So what are the different ways, I guess, that we would respond? So there's all these key players who are making decisions and preparing for either a reactionary or proactive response to national security threats. And what are some of the ways that you can think of highlighting that are some of our responses?
And thinking about how to respond to emerging threats. I mean, if you think about your own life and how you might respond to an aggressive neighbor who is, throwing his trash on your property, let's say, versus how you might respond to a friend who was doing something, versus how you would respond to a colleague versus a stranger on the other side of the planet. I mean, do you have a one-size-fits-all strategy for dealing with the people in your life? No, of course not. And so one of the key things that is an incredible challenge in national security strategizing is how to figure out the best way to respond to different scenarios and different actors, because obviously the US has a different relationship with Canada than it has with North Korea.
Right.
And so figuring out the best way to respond for the scenario and the actor at hand is key. And so you've got, this toolkit, so to speak, of tools, instruments that the US could use to respond to a national security threat. And so, you have armed force as a tool.
Right.
The US decided to carry out a drone strike to kill al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, who was in Kabul, Afghanistan. Normally, armed forces used as a tool of last resort, but here's a scenario where the US knew where this individual was hiding. They knew how to strike at this individual in a way that would really reduce civilian casualties, quote unquote, collateral damage. And it was a very high profile way of sending a message to al-Qaeda and to the Taliban that the US can reach into Afghanistan and carry out such actions at fairly minimal cost, right? And so some of these things really need to be done on a case-by-case basis. We can't have, a one-size-fits-all strategy, and it really is necessary to look at the tools that we have and what's best for that particular scenario at that particular time. Mm-hmm. And some of the other tools that we have are, diplomacy, sanctions, which seems to be the tool of choice recently, and we can talk about whether sanctions work or not.
We'll be doing that later in the podcast series. We outline that, so
great.
We'll be asking you back.
Nice. Yeah. Foreign aid is also another tool in the toolkit because the US, like other powers, uses carrots and sticks to get other actors to do what we want them to do. And so, foreign aid usually comes with strings attached. It ain't charity, people.
Yeah, I think that's key, that everything that we do or everything that the government does in the collective your name is really tied to that national security, tied to that carrot and stick. And of course, we want to use as many carrots as we can, but not everybody likes carrots. So sometimes, you gotta be a little stronger in your response. And even within that, you can vary your responses. Of course, not every national security threat needs to be taken care of with a nuclear bomb. Very, very, very few of them, if any, need to be taken care of that way. So, yeah, I think collaboration is huge.
Absolutely. And so, bringing up nukes, you can't just make empty threats. They have to be credible. You can't say, well, we're going to nuke you if you don't, do
Putin
X,
seems
Y,
to be
Z.
doing well with that. That seems to be his go-to thing is, you're gonna give planes to Ukraine? Well, guess what? I'm gonna nuke the entire.
Right. Well, we have all of these nukes that, we want to use. So,
but I don't know that Putin should be our
I don't know either.
idol of sane, rational thought in national security.
Indeed.
Melinda, one of the things too is that as we're talking about all this seems like a conversation that happens so far away from us at home, right? It's something that once we're listening in, it's like we're seeing about it on the news. These decisions are happening, for me at least, on the other side of the country. And so one key thing here that we try to do is really understand how this relates and how it impacts us here at home. So I was wondering if you could touch a little bit about that piece. Like, what are some things that we see on the day-to-day basis are a direct result of the work that's happening in the realm of national security, and how are ways that we could get involved?
It's clear when you pick up a newspaper. Okay, I guess nobody picks up a newspaper anymore. I'm showing my age.
Yeah.
Okay, nobody's picking up a newspaper anymore. Excuse me.
Okay,
when you log into the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever you read, you hear about things like global supply chains and, the global food crisis and so on that's been sparked by the war in Ukraine. And so there are clear ripple effects to the things happening in faraway places, and they affect us directly and indirectly every single day. And some of those are talked about a lot in the newspapers, the examples that I just gave. And some of those are a lot more hidden. And so I like to tell my students, to pay attention to the World Trade Organization, which most people haven't even heard of, let alone know what it does or why it was created and so on. But I mean, it impacts our lives every single day, and we're not even aware of the myriad ways that World Trade Organization regulations and such play a direct role in our lives. And so it's hard, I think, for people, including myself, and I get paid to read the paper and teach about these things, to keep up with all of the ways that these global supply chains and global institutions like the WTO and wars in faraway places are impacting us. And so I think the best place to look for information, first and foremost, is, the newspapers, media, but
with an asterisk.
But and in terms of, back to your question about how it relates to us at home, okay, so if we can agree that things are clearly impacting us and we want to also have a say in how our own government reacts and responds to these things, then what should we be doing? I mean, because gaining knowledge, I think, is the first step. First, we should educate ourselves on the issues, and then think about how we as everyday citizens could play a role in shaping the policies of our own government and beyond, because there are a lot of people who are activists and who are working on things that have them lobbying governments and institutions beyond the US. I mean, so there are a lot of different ways that everyday citizens like us could play a role in these foreign policy decisions.
So we're coming up on time here, but I think a really insightful question will be, can you tell us what your students are interested in when it comes to national security? What is it that they're thinking about? What does the future hold for American national security thought through the eyes of current students?
Climate change, climate change, climate change.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to talk to young people and then to talk to people who are not so young and who are up there in years. And climate change is an issue that's discussed regularly by my students, even when it's not on the syllabus. And I also think big issues like Russia and China that they hear about on the news and also from other people in their everyday lives are of interest to them. I think some more obscure issues are lost on some of the younger people who just don't understand why we have nukes in the first place and are befuddled by the Iran-US relations, for example. But climate change is definitely the number one issue that my undergrad students are concerned about.
So everything has been swept up into national security. Do you believe that's a good thing or a bad thing? And particularly in the sense of the militarization of operations around the world. So should the military have really been trying to rebuild the Afghan government, or should that maybe have gone to, State Department, who's kind of trained in that?
Yes.
Yes.
It's almost like I knew the answer to that. Knew the answer to the question I was asking.
So I'll answer the first question. So there's this ongoing debate about securitization and how so many things are being securitized that it's become a problem because it lends itself to overcommitting in areas that perhaps are not so important at this point in time. And if everything is an area of national security, then nothing is really an area of national security. And so clearly we need to prioritize certain national security threats and crises as they emerge. But there is also this argument that, if you label something a national security threat, then you go into this mode of crisis politics. And if you're in this mode of crisis politics, you are more likely to do things that you might not do in everyday politics. And it may be forced, it may be rushed, it may not be as rational, and it may be difficult to transition away from that crisis politics mode into climate change is going to be with us forever. So are we always going to be deer in the headlights mode, or do we just need to figure out how to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, still understanding that this is an issue that needs to be prioritized? But it seems like the way to get people's attention anymore is to say this is a national security priority. Mm-hmm. And if we don't say that, then it must not be important. And yes, there are many of us who think that is problematic. And yes, unfortunately, because the Department of Defense is this behemoth with all the money in the world. Okay, that's a slight exaggeration, but only by a bit. But only by a bit. It became the go-to agency for all of the things the U.S. wanted to accomplish in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, to use the examples that you gave earlier, Tim. And so it's absolutely the case that the State Department and USAID should have been given more tools, more resources, more money to accomplish things like quote unquote state building in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And instead, we had special forces who were carrying out these types of activities, even though they were ill-equipped to do so and not specially trained to do those types of things. I mean, no one's going to argue that the U.S. does not have the strongest, most powerful, most impressive military in the world, but, they are not state builders per se.
I just want to say how grateful we are that you took the time to be with us today, Melinda, and to share a little bit about your insights with Tim, myself, and our listeners on the Drinks and Diplomacy podcast. And was just wondering if there was any other last tidbits you'd like to share about national security, the work you do, the reason why you are working in national security.
Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me to speak with you and Tim about these important issues.
So, Melinda, we've heard a lot of great tidbits from you today. Just thank you for sharing again your insight and information. At the end of all of our episodes, we like to do a little cheers and together with our drinks. And so I'll count down from 3, 3, 2, 1, and then we will cheers. So 3, 2, 1. Salud.
Plancha.
Salud.
Thank y'all so much.
The Drinks and Diplomacy podcast is a joint program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and World Oregon.
Your co-hosts and producers are Andrea Castillo, Program Officer at World Oregon, and Tim Horgan, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire.
The audio editor is Tim Horgan.
Our theme music is We Are One by Scott Holmes Music.
Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment. Until next time.